You're listening to the Beyond My Battle podcast. I'm your host, Martel Catalano. Part intimate, part informative, and wholly designed to support you in your journey, each episode combines personal stories with expert insights to explore the many themes of life with illness or disability. Welcome back to our listeners. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. For me, there's been such a mixture of emotions over the last few months, and I keep hearing from people who are confused or conflicted about how to feel, who have happy and sad days, or even moods that swing a bunch of different directions within a single day. And there's just so much information going around right now and so many feelings, and I just wanted to drop a quick personal note in here to say that it's okay to have lots of feelings right now, and that all we can do is continue to not just take care of ourselves, of course in body and in mind, but observe what we're feeling. Just being witness to whatever comes up during these challenging times and using this as a time to cultivate greater awareness that can then help us meet future adversity with resilience. So I just wanted to say that, but I'm so excited to bring you this episode because, well, if you recall our first ever episode of the show, we talked with some people about how they manage the emotions of having an illness or disability themselves. We always knew we wanted to make this episode, which is kind of the flip side of that. It's the caregiver side of managing their own emotions around their loved one's diagnosis. We have two stories to share with you to start, Steve and Sarah, that are truly the most honest and inspiring anecdotes. Both guests happen to be parents of children with rare diseases, and they share with us what it was like to get that diagnosis for their child, how they initially responded emotionally, and how they went on to find community and care for themselves so that they could show up and be the best caregiver possible. We also speak with Dr. Lisa Dungate, who is a licensed mental health counselor. Lisa lends such a wise and compassionate voice as someone working with individuals facing illness or disability, and she has her own lived experience with this too. She talks about grieving, addressing feelings of helplessness, which I know are so common, supporting loved ones effectively, and managing caregiver burnout by practicing self-care. One last note before we begin is that we will be taking a brief break after this episode to slightly tweak the show's format, so be sure to tune back in and see how we've shifted to better meet your needs as a listener. Let's dive into the episode.
My name is Steve Rosado, and I live here in Saratoga Springs, and I have a son named Matthew Rosado, who was born in August of 2000. And Matthew was diagnosed with a rare genetic disease called Felipo Syndrome. Interesting enough, though, Matthew was born in August of 2000, but his diagnosis was not till 2008.
My name is Sarah Blankowski, and I live in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I do a lot of different type of work as a movement teacher and an educator and a researcher. And I am the mom of 3 kids, and my eldest daughter, Josie, is almost 14, and she has Down syndrome and autism and many other complex medical issues, infectious asthma, obstructive sleep apnea, and many behavioral and sensory integration challenges. So that has made kind of my primary role as a caregiver. And then I try to work around that.
So Felipo Syndrome is a very rare genetic disease. It's considered an orphan disease, meaning that there's such a rare population out there. It's only 1 in 70,000 births. So if you think about that, that's only 11 in a million. So if you think about, a big jar of jelly beans with 1 million jelly beans and you have to go pick out the 11 in there, that visual kind of brings home how rare this is. So essentially, Matthew is lacking an enzyme, or enough of an enzyme that we're all born with, to break down a sugar protein called heparan sulfate. So as a result, it's a progressive disease. So over time, what it'll eventually do is tear down essentially everything: the central nervous system, the organs, the muscular system, the skeletal system. Sadly, it is conclusive, the diagnosis, and it is considered quote unquote untreatable and incurable, and also fatal. So the average mortality rate for people afflicted with this is somewhere between the ages of 10 and 20 years of age. And Matthew happens to be 19 now.
Josie was born on a Friday afternoon, and then Sunday afternoon, the neonatologists come in with our pediatrician, pushing the little plastic baby cart. And then the neonatologist very matter-of-factly says, your daughter's bilirubin count is going really high. She's getting dehydrated. We have to take her to the nursery. And then the pediatrician is, kind of translating this in a very loving way. And then at the end, it's like, well, we're pretty sure your daughter also has Down syndrome.
When it was mentioned to send him for genetic testing by his pediatric neurologist, we were brought into the office and we were, given the results. And they give you what they call genetic counseling, because it's such a rare disease that when they convey it to you, you've never heard of it. It's not something you've read about. Even Matthew's pediatrician said this particular disease they spent maybe 1 hour in med school on, just because it's not a big enough population of kids. So to be told that your son has been afflicted with this very rare disease, it's untreatable, it's incurable, and that the life expectancy is somewhere to early teens, and he's 8 years old, it's devastating. It's a devastating feeling, and we asked, what can we do? And he said, love your child, because really it's been around. It was discovered in 1962, and there's nothing you can do.
We were privileged with, good work, good insurance, good access to medical care. But even with all this privilege, all of this fear started creeping in, and then all of this kind of sadness, because all of a sudden we are leaving typical. We are leaving a lot of what we felt we knew.
The news was devastating, and I was filled with fear and anger and worry. But I also had a big responsibility as the provider of my family. I'm like, how am I going to do my day job and carry this on my mind and potentially, work towards a solution? It's a very weird emotion to be given a death sentence, if you will, for your child, but it's not happening in the next week or months or potentially even the next several years. But you're told, but it will happen eventually, and that the demise is difficult and painful, and there's going to be a lot of suffering. The dreams of what you expected, when you had kids, just went up in smoke. Then there's the fear factor as to what is this and what does this mean for Matthew, for my child. And then there's all that anxiety and all of that stress, and it's the fear of the unknown. I guess the good news is, for all those years that he was misdiagnosed or without diagnosis, you were just kind of moving around this very dark room with nothing to work on. But when the diagnosis was finally given and it was correct and conclusive, at least now it has a label and you know what you're dealing with, albeit it's not a good label and it's not something you wanted to hear, but at least you have something tangible that you can research, understand, and perhaps even get connected with other people that have similar situations going on.
Through a lot of investigation, reading a couple years of really kind of studying behavioral things and a lot of other medical things, my daughter was given the dual diagnosis of Down syndrome autism. And then that was also a journey where it was like, whoa, we're here in this place too. I was so overwhelmed. And I'm a researcher. My part of my background is studying history. So the researcher in me was like, this is really overwhelming. I need to just sit with this for a while. So in between trying to just feed Josie when she was a baby, I purposely told myself just to take a couple weeks and not Google, not start reading, not start researching until I was able to kind of emotionally kind of process or try to wrap my head around, just our day to day and just trying to enjoy being a new mom, enjoy this little baby. I kind of delayed diving in. And then when I did start diving in, I started reaching out to community and I started meeting other parents of babies and older children with Down syndrome.
For devastating news, you think we're going to rush right to, if you get diagnosed with cancer, they're going to start putting out a care plan for, cancer, whether it's chemo or radiation therapy or what have you. But to sit in an office and say, there's nothing you can do. For me personally, I went through a difficult period because I had all these emotions that I didn't expect to feel, that all of a sudden, boom, came down on me. So I threw myself at work. I threw myself at travel. I prayed a lot for my son. I sort of accepted that there's not much we can do. And honestly, for a period of time, I was almost running from the situation, almost in a feeling of denial initially, because it was just too much to bear. I didn't know how to process it. What I did not do was I did not practice self-care at that time.
I did not get a lot of sleep. And when you don't get a lot of sleep for a long time, it changes all of your brain chemistry. You can become very depressed. There are a couple of nights where I was so tired. The next day, I was not fit to drive. It was not safe to drive. A lot of people would be like, oh, do X, Y, Z. But when you're the one doing the night shift, you're on call. So a lot of the self-care practices, that's really nice. Go to a yoga class or, go to an expensive spa, but we don't have the money because we're paying co-pays.
It was so important to get connected with other people. And it didn't have to be the same exact diagnosis or the same exact disease, but I needed to get connected with people that have gone through other difficult situations or that are currently going through difficult circumstances, just to not feel alone in this matter. And because it can feel very alone. When you get a diagnosis that's rare and it's genetic, you can feel very quickly like I'm the only parent going through this, or I'm the only, Matthew's the only child going through this. But that's not the truth. That's not the truth. That's the narrative we tell ourselves, because it's so easy to default into a pity party rather than crawl out of it and say, okay, what's the next right and responsible thing to do here?
So what I always try to share with caregiver burnout is, we're trying to keep everybody alive. So let's just be realistic there. Some days you might not get a shower in, and that's going to be rough. So whatever we can do, that's what we need to focus on. But I'm finding that in my own self-care, a big component of self-care is feeling connected to community. So I'm really loving now that there's Facebook groups that you can, somebody is awake, your fellow caregivers, somebody might not be able to be sleeping because the nurses keep coming in every couple hours in the hospital. So you could be texting and talking at 3 a.m. to somebody in the world, and that loving connection that you're not alone, on night duty is just so amazing and loving and supportive.
They tell you in a plane, the first thing you got to do is put the oxygen mask on yourself before you can be of service to anybody. So the first thing I had to do with the help of others was, practice self-care. What are the things that are good for me and good for the situation, is moving this in a positive direction, and what things should I take off my plate? And then it's, getting around other people, because we're basically pack animals. We're not designed to go through things alone. So getting a support group was helpful. And then through other people, I started getting introduced to, things I knew were out there, but I never actually participated, such as yoga, such as meditation, group meditation, getting involved with programs that allow you to go through stressful times as a group that, teach you those practices as well as some other measures.
So many people, after you have a child with lots of medical challenges, if you want to have another child, there's definitely this energy you feel where people are scared for you, or people are like, how dare you?
Matthew, I mentioned, is nonverbal, which sounds like a curse, but in a world that over-communicates, It's a very powerful instrument. My son talks with his eyes, and he hugs, and he laughs all the time. As far as I can tell, he has no worries about the future. He doesn't seem to have any remorse or sadness about yesterday. He doesn't seem to have an ego. I mean, he doesn't worry about what he's wearing that day and what he's eating and how he looks and is his hair combed. He's without ego. So he doesn't have any concerns. Like I said, he's 100% reliant on other people for help. I think that's also very powerful because in a world that people so often don't want to ask others for help, my son would not survive without the help of others. So I look at him, and by the way, when a bird flies overhead, he stops, he looks up, and he starts to laugh. So I look at him, and once you change your lenses, I thought to myself, who really is the teacher here and who's the student? Because when you think about it, we'll call my son mentally challenged. When you don't know what his disease is, he looks like he's mentally challenged. But the reality is, with everything going on in the world, we are actually the ones who are so challenged mentally with got to have bigger, brighter, shinier, newer, got to get a better job, got to get a better house, got to get a house, got to sell my house. There's so much noise going through our ears. And when I look at Matthew, he is the embodiment of the purest of the human spirit before we layer it or shroud it with all those worries that come into our life. I laugh to myself that normal people, quote unquote, will pay thousands of dollars to a therapist or a spiritual healer just to get to 5 minutes of Matthew's way of thinking.
We have a lot of fear because sometimes it's just so outside of our realm of what we grew up with or felt comfortable with. But I think when, the gift of just being in the trenches and getting to know and meet people with all different types of abilities and challenges and sensory needs. And this journey has been so much expansion. Like I almost just kind of feel bad that a lot of people don't get it. What I've found in it as a takeaway is that it has allowed me to grow far more than I feel that I would have been able without all of those experiences. And I'm very grateful.
I will say this, there is no plane ticket I can buy to anywhere in the world that is going to be nearly as eye-opening and interesting, perhaps even fascinating, as the discovery process of taking the journey within myself to see how it is I'm thinking and how it is I'm processing this disease. And how is it that I view this disease and my son and the world in general? And in doing that and learning how to go inside myself, it opens up all these doors that were otherwise closed to me. But the compelling event to force my hand to do so was the diagnosis of my son. Had my son not then been diagnosed with this disease and all those emotions came to the forefront, I would never probably have been forced down a path of having to practice some degree of self-care, in which case it's given me the opportunity to go on this journey of self-exploration and as a result, be more present and available to him and other family members and other friends. So in a weird way, the diagnosis was a bit of a blessing. And I feel very uncomfortable saying that because I might say, if I was detached from this, how dare he call it the diagnosis of a rare disease a blessing? But, sometimes blessings come wrapped in very funny packages. It's not so much about the disease, but it's about what paths it sent everybody down.
I want to share a couple resources we have specifically for care partners. Every Tuesday, we have a live virtual support group that is facilitated and a judgment-free place for caregivers to talk, listen, and meet like-minded people in similar life circumstances. You can sign up for that group on our website under the Support tab. We also have a caregiver-specific ebook called Becoming a Source of Calm. And for less than the cost of a latte, you get this in-depth resource full of exercises and information on not only managing caregiver stress, but cultivating a healthy and calming relationship with your loved one who is living with an illness or disability. That ebook is under the Resources tab at our website, beyondmybattle.org. Now back to our episode.
My name is Dr. Lisa Dungate, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor working in upstate New York in Saratoga Springs at a holistic health center where I have my own private practice and have for many years. I've been in the field of mental health counseling, social services for, I guess, about 30 years at this point.
Thanks for coming on to the show. We're so happy for you to lend your insight into this important topic. When we started Beyond My Battle, I just want to say we initially thought that the organization would be mostly for people with diagnoses themselves, and quickly realized that it was going to be just as much about care partners and those who love people with diagnoses. And today I want to talk with you about the emotions that surround that experience. The one thing that is, of course, sticking out to me initially is a lot of people know at birth, if they're a parent, that their child is potentially with a diagnosis. And a lot of people meet a diagnosis later in life, whether it's their child or any loved one that develops a chronic condition or a disability. Do you work with a lot of people in both scenarios? What is your experience in that regard?
I certainly do. I have a number of patients that I may have started with that had an alarming diagnosis, whether it was a sudden cancer diagnosis or, as you said, a loved one who is facing degenerative illness like Alzheimer's disease, or other individuals with Lyme in particular, and some of the psychoneurological effects that have come with it chronically living in the system. Certainly others with autoimmune conditions. And primarily, I would say that people seek me out because they're looking for individualized support, a safe space where they can talk about some of those emotions and experiences, questions, grief in particular, that they may perceive are heavy for their family members at this time, or they just want a really kind of unbiased individual who can listen on behalf of what their experience is. And I would also say that I bring my own personal experience with having a number of family members who have faced life-threatening illnesses, diagnoses, and or chronic health conditions. So that started pretty young in my life with my mother battling chronic fatigue syndrome and walking along with her and how to be a supportive care partner and loved one, when one of our family members is really struggling.
I know as someone living with a diagnosis myself, there's this sense of loss of control. And I think that that's a common theme as well for the person who is the loved one of whoever has the diagnosis. You feel like you can't control, especially if it's degenerative, like you said, or especially incurable disease. In my case, my parents, I know, felt like they couldn't fix this. And that was really, really difficult for them. And I don't know if you can speak on that theme being present in the work that you do.
What I noticed in my work is helping support people to find their zones of competence is what I would language it as, where they can be effective. Yes, there are still going to be moments of feeling powerless and helpless and wrapped up in the suffering of the person that we're supporting as well. And yet we are also, to some degree, we're outside of the experience in many ways as well. I know that other people you've interviewed have talked about how essential self-care is. And I also liken when I work with loved ones who are being care partners to really make sure that they've got their oxygen mask on themselves first, as flight attendants remind us so caringly when we, take flight to whatever journey we're entering, that we are not as effective if we're not taking really good care of ourselves. And I guess I'm somebody who fortunately has learned to cultivate a practice of living in possibility, looking at the perspective that every problem has a solution. So that's something that I need to get into action. That doesn't mean that I'm going to try to skip over or encourage others to skip over complicated and troubling emotions around coming to a place, quote unquote, of acceptance with what you may be facing or a loved one may be facing. But I do think that I'm somebody that does look for solutions and looks for ways that I can, be creative and be effective, essentially, essentially, because so much of that anxiety and the stress around receiving a diagnosis, living with a chronic health condition, is that sense of powerlessness. And I think finding ways that we can feel potent and not impotent in facing something challenging in life is important.
Yeah, absolutely. On that topic of stress and those difficult emotions, what are the emotions that you see as most present for care partners when a diagnosis of someone they love deeply enters their life? Is it mostly fear-based? Is it sadness? Of course, there's a range, but I'm wondering if you can speak on what that looks like from the therapists.
I find Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's approach and her way of, and of course it wasn't, it's really been much more broadly applied than just in dealing with death and dying, but looking at what is called the DABDA method or ideology. So we start with a phase of denial, of wanting to not look at that. I know that was part of my own family's experience recently, facing my own husband's diagnosis, that one of my children kind of just went in and they acknowledged to me when I was speaking with them in preparation for this interview, just what their learning had been, just going through this in the last year ourselves as a family, dealing with a health crisis. And one of them said, yeah, they really noticed. They just went into a place of denial. They didn't want to really look at it. It was really shocking as a now adult child to suddenly see one's parent as vulnerable, as fragile, and really coming to grips with their own parents' mortality, and then of course, by nature, looking at our own. And then the next phase that she would talk about is a state of anger and just wanting to rage at the world. And I think there's themes when I've heard others that you've interviewed talking about this sense of unfairness and why me. And, these are all important emotions to acknowledge and not fight. I think as Jung said, what we resist persists. So allowing it to be there, it won't be there forever. Waves of emotion come over us, and then they, just like the ocean, they will recede once again. The next phase that she talks about, and again, keeping in mind that this model is not meant to be a linear model. We don't go through one phase and then the next phase. I find we bounce around. But the next phase that she basically framed was called bargaining. So very much related to denial, just wanting to argue, negotiate, not want it to be real. This is sometimes when we can get into conflict with providers. We want to second guess, get second opinions, and find some of the answers that actually fit for us. Then really there can be a real phase of, I would say, anxiety is very wrapped up in the depression phase as well, a lot of sadness and loss, coming to grips of, for example, I can speak for my own family, just recognizing that my husband couldn't drive for 6 months and what that, meant for him, how much of his identity was based in things that you take for granted as you come to a place of accepting, ultimately is the final phase of a new normal. And that accepting is always evolving. We get to a place and then we bounce back. Now we're back in anger again. And, something else will come up that will trigger that. You find yourself in a new situation where something that you could navigate previously that was pretty easeful is now not. Part of what I work with people is starting to adopt, and I think this is so linked in with part of your mission statement here in terms of mindfulness, compassion, and empathy, is that adopting that position of the observer, that we don't become the diagnosis. We don't become the emotion. We observe it. I am not an anxious person. I have moments of anxiety. I am not my diagnosis. I'm not my health condition. I do, experience these symptoms. And so I think that sometimes helps to give us some perspective, because otherwise it cuts so deeply to our identity, and finding where we can still, again, have that sense of, what are we competent, what are we able to do, as opposed to focusing so much on what we no longer have or what we are not able to do.
I want to go back to the cycle, the Kubler-Ross cycle, and talk about where that cycle quote unquote ends in that acceptance part, because it doesn't really end there. And I think that's why acceptance is really a tricky word. At least for me, I find it very difficult to talk about acceptance, because I feel like it's a journey. It's never really a place you get, because as soon as you start to accept something, that guilt might start setting back in, right? Like, I'm going to accept that my child is different than what I had imagined them to be. And now that I accept it, I'm suddenly feeling guilty that that I accept this. And then the cycle starts back up.
And it's not, I don't see it as a passive process. I guess that's what it is. It's not getting to a place of arriving. In our culture, we have such an impotence towards I'll be happy when. And some of my work with folks is to recognize that, yes, we'll have moments of joy and we'll have moments of sorrow. We'll have moments of anger and we'll have moments of happiness. And also part of entwined with the position or the posture of being the observer is this art of non-attachment. And I think that's a very deep way of living. And yet it's complicated because when it's a loved one, we're so deeply attached to them and who we are. And so how do we stay attached but also non-attached, most especially to our stories about who they are, who we are. So if we're looking at responding, the title of our podcast today, responding to a loved one's diagnosis, part of that is getting our own self as the loved one out of the way and listening on behalf of what their experience is, how we can be supportive. We are, by the nature of having these amazing brains of ours, we are meaning-making mechanisms. And so there's what happens, and then there's this overlying what we make it mean in life. And I guess I've been fortunate enough to do training with people like Eckhart Tolle or Byron Katie of looking at just, again, increasingly ways of being present with our experience and looking for the kindest version of reality. That doesn't mean that some diagnoses or health challenges or life challenges are not going to absolutely bring us to our knees. And yet every time, and many times in Buddhist practice, it's like let the heart break many times over. And it's antithetical to what we wish for. Nobody wants their heart to be broken open. Mm-hmm. And yet through that process, it is a transformative process. And the heart opens and it heals and it opens even more. And you think you're at your limit in terms of how much you can love someone and be there, especially when they're in pain. And yet it's just to move toward that instead of away from that. I've always found such an incredible gift. And it's not easy. It takes immense courage to be with somebody that is suffering. I think of family members I've sat with that are in late stages of Alzheimer's disease. And really, they were asking me to be present, kind of like what Steve was sharing with his beautiful son, Matthew. They're so present. And we can get into this monkey mind of like wanting to fill space and time with verbiage and interpretation and assumption and expectation. And so what if you strip all that away and you're just really with somebody? That's both an incredible gift, but it also, in my experience, takes immense courage.
I know a lot of people see their loved one in the early stages perhaps as what is quote unquote wrong or what is quote unquote unfair or unjust, or the inabilities that they may have due to their situation, or maybe the inabilities that themselves as the caregiver has. But how do you work with people on flipping that around to think of, in Steve's case, like you mentioned, this experience is rewarding, and my child, yes, maybe has some limitations, but they teach me and they're enjoying life. How do you work with people to change that?
Part of it is that I adopt a belief of dropping any expectation for where they should be. We are where we are, and just being with people where they're at is important, and trusting that we have some goals that we're working on, obviously more of a sense of peace with what is happening in their life, acceptance, as you say, and it can be a complicated word to use. I want to preface with that. So part of the way that I interpret some of the mentors and teachers that I've had in my own life is that, and I guess that's a combination of marriage with my own mental health counseling training, is that emotional life is very important to tend to. I sort of, in my work, I really slow things down. I drop an agenda of who somebody should be, where they should be. I'm cultivating, again, back to that art of listening on behalf. I don't know what this person, what this experience, what the diagnosis, what living with this health condition means for that person. And so I am a deeply curious human. I'm curious what that experience is meaning for that person, and try really not to superimpose rather my interpretation of that. And again, back to that piece of that lost art of listening on behalf of the other. We all deeply desire to be heard and to be validated in our experience. I don't have to have every single diagnosis or health condition or mental health concern of anybody that I work with. I work from a place of deep compassion and understanding and going on a treasure trove of my own experiences so that I can look for what, in terms of at the level of humanity and humanitarianism, I can relate to. But I'm certainly not going to come across as somebody, hopefully, that thinks that I know what another person's experience may be.
Yeah, often one creates a idealized or imagined version of the life that they were going to have, especially parents who are about to have a child. And I know we've, in this episode, talked to two parents, at least. And you walked us through that experience of going through a state of disbelief or denial, and then there's a grieving process there too. And I wonder if you can speak about that grieving process, because I know it's essential. You're grieving not a death, but the death of something you thought was going to be your life, like this death of a dream,
and the loss of idealized expectations. And I encourage people to find the space within themselves not to judge that, first of all, not to judge or think, I shouldn't be feeling concerned about this because at least my child is alive. There's ways that we can minimize, I think, just trying to meet and be as real with that. It ceases to have such a hold on us when we just are able and brave enough to acknowledge, this is sad for me today. This is sad for me to recognize that my child might not ever get married and or have their own children, especially when I sit with parents that have such immense courage when they're facing a child's diagnosis, mental health-wise in particular, because that is the population that I work with, whether it's being on the spectrum or dealing with obsessive-compulsive disorder, other disorders that, may cause that child, that adolescent, that young adult deep pain in their life and also interfere with them meeting certain developmental milestones that we all are just attached to because that's what we grew up understanding, is what comes next. And so then when we're able to let go of that old normal, quote unquote, we can begin to shift and come into an acceptance and even, as Steve was mentioning, a delight in what is the new normal. And that is complicated because I never want to make light of what that process is for each individual. Sometimes people can stay stuck in those phases for a while. And just being with them in that and in that grief, I think if we can find a few people that we feel safe enough to let that be okay, that really helps to get us unstuck.
I want to talk about support. I mean, support for the care partners is definitely an essential part of self-care and essential part of managing the common burnout that comes with being a caregiver. What is your idea of what support looks like best?
I think it looks unique for every different person. I know for myself, as soon as my husband became ill this past spring, I immediately signed up for another half marathon with my daughter because we knew we would be needing to support him for at least the next 6 months. So support looks like, again, just kind of regrouping and going back to, I often will encourage people to make a list of 30 things that bring them joy or calm or peace, things that it may have even been since childhood that they enjoyed. And the reason that I come up with 30 is that then they've got one thing a day for the next month or the next month after that month to be nurturing of themselves. Support can look like, increasingly, it looks like finding a therapist because back in the day, we might have had extended family. I know I'm a transplant here and our family is very few, in this area. And so often therapists have now moved into that role of what was our family or extended family support or a chaplain or a pastor or a rabbi that we would be able to go to and get some sage advice from. For myself and for so many of my patients, reading other people's memoirs, hearing podcasts like yours that are so beautifully executed. And I've just been so heartened by people's honesty and their openness and realness. And there's nothing like dealing with a diagnosis and some sort of health condition or pain to just bring us to our knees and crack us open of who we are really at our most base level as loving humans on this planet. So there are support groups that people can reach out to, certainly in the social media age, online groups, though I have to say it's important to find a kindred community. That can sometimes add more stress to us in being part of some of the online, groups that can be out there. So I encourage people to check in. How do I feel when I'm spending time with these people? Is this giving to me or is it taking from me? And to hang in there. And it may not be the first person that you reach out to for support or the first doctor that you connect with, but, keep looking and paying attention to who feels like good people for you.
What is some advice that you'd like to leave people with that they can implement into their lives every day?
I think that piece of compassion for ourselves, like letting us be enough, I love, Steve also mentioned the work of Don Miguel Ruiz, who wrote the 4 Agreements, which I also is a seminal work that I draw from, that our best is going to look different on different days, and letting today be enough. I think there's this, we can so compare our insides with others' outsides so easily. What looks like someone who's like dealing with a diagnosis like MS and running and doing all these things. And if that's not our reality, living with the same condition, be careful not to judge yourself or oneself for not being in a place that you think you should be or could be or would be. I think those are very damaging. Those 3 words, just letting what is showing up, how you're showing up, be enough and be compassionate, with oneself.
This show is presented by Beyond My Battle, a nonprofit helping people manage the stress of illness and disability. All of the organization's resources, like this podcast, are rooted in mindfulness, awareness, and compassion to help individuals and care partners live happier, healthier, and more resilient lives. To support the podcast or any of our other programs, visit beyondmybattle.org/donate. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, review, and share with your family and friends.